conducted so many more studies, and I've got more stuff to draw on. Interestingly, I'll start with a study that was not mine. A year and a half ago, Adweek Nielsen did an evaluation of people multitasking while they were watching television, and you know what they found? This is not a gender issue. Oh, and check this out. Even though younger people maybe have a higher propensity, this is not even just an age issue. People multitasking while they're watching television. Well, we know that people are multitasking in in-person conferences too. So when it comes to today, our goal is to say, hey, if that's kind of the reality of the world, what are we going to do, especially now that email or some other distraction is one click away? Oh, somebody said, hey, what was the hashtag? Oh, James chatted it out there, so the chat tab over on the right-hand side is where you'll see hashtag 7sins. Our goal is pretty simple. We got 7 things that we hope to spare you from in terms of making mistakes. And number 1, quite interestingly, was one of investing in one's own success. My most recent study was of why people leave webinars early. And in fact, one of the things that I will do today is chat out to you some links where you can pick these papers up from Citrix, or you can get them from, you can email me after the fact. But how likely would they be to leave a webinar early? Probably, I would hope it would be a no-brainer, but people have to keep saying it. You know what? Don't sell to me unless I expect a sales pitch. And number 2, presenter is boring out of 13 different responses. Well, now we kind of get that the in-person experience is just natural. How do we connect with people? If we're not delivering keynote speeches, we figure out somehow that we're going to connect with and interact with and make that happen. And yet one of the studies that I conducted a couple years ago found that better than half of people actually spend more time, invest more time in an in-person presentation than in a webinar presentation. Kind of ironic, given that we move into a new medium, which tends to make our adrenaline go up and our effectiveness go down, right? If you're a communications geek, this is called the transmission theory or the medium theory of communication, and it affects our our sensory and cognitive stimuli, right? Well, here's the good news. Go to webinar and virtual presentations are hard, but they are different, right? How many times have we sat through something where somebody kind of just didn't feel comfortable in their own skin, or, you're the marketer and you put somebody on stage and it's like, oh man, we got a lot of registrants, but they're bailing out 10 minutes into this. For the last 100 years, the way you and I have connected live in real time is with the telephone, or now in a more modern sense, perhaps voice over IP. And then we added the ability to see the desktop, and then one of the things that's really nice now is video. Though video I don't think is the answer. And unless you're making a keynote presentation, honestly, one of the most powerful things you can do is actually interact with people. In fact, the word educate comes from the Latin meaning to draw out. I want to give you 3 things to do to start mapping, and if you're going to take the time to avoid the sin of not investing in your own not investing in where you're going. Number 1 is you got to analyze what you've got cooking. Number 2 is then map that to something, the tools that facilitate a similar type of behavior or communication in the virtual world. And I will chat out to you a link where you can get this table so you don't have to try to write it all down. But we've got one other step. In fact, for those of you who are so awesome because you've done this so many times, or you've got some experience, hey, what's actually something, one thing, anything that you can do easier or better in an online presentation, in a webinar or webcast? Easier or better than an in-person presentation?
Miriam says, speak to multiple people at the same time. Engage attendees, says Terry. In fact, not only engage people, but get their responses back, right? Get simultaneous participation is what Scott said. That's what's going on right now. JB, first thing that came to my mind when I saw this, same thing with Chris, both of them saying, Roger, polls. It's a lot easier, and people might be more willing and are more willing actually to raise their hand on a poll or answer a poll question, things like that.
Yeah, I'm laughing with Lori. She says, no one can see you sweating online. If you leave the camera off. Give them candies to keep them awake. You know what? Actually, I'll tell you a different story a different time. One of my blog posts recently was about people who shipped lunches, and I've seen lunch and learns and all kinds of things available in the done online. Pretty simple. We've got to know what we're doing. We've got to map to a new platform, and usually the place that people start to fall down and why we see so many boring webinars about webinars is that we fail to go, oh, what can we do uniquely, right? Look at the raised hand function that we just did with the poll. It's not even just, oh, I see about 28% have never done it, right? Do you stop and go figure out 28% in an in-person audience? No, you go, oh, okay, a third of you do this, half of you do this. But, you know, besides the exact numbers, we could even report on that if it was a test or we wanted to feed that information to our sales team or whatever that is. Number two, not creating a sense of presence. When we share an experience in an online world, in an offline world, there are all kinds of things that are part of our human experience, and when we move online, we feel like we're sitting there all by our lonesome self. Now, we tried to say, hey, we've got somebody in Guatemala, and I saw my friend Sandy in the UK, and I see Kelly in Atlanta, right? Which means that if we're not figuring out how to take advantage of the fact that you and I are live, and I can see that Kathy just said also helps document something for grant funding. Dang cool, right? That's kind of like Kathy making a comment with the rest of us. And if we're not doing that, to me, my humble opinion, I think that's a failure. I think there's also some powerful psychosocial things that are part of that, right? Chris Brogan, trust agents, saying a few words back is a nice way to feel, for people to feel heard and seen. Hey, what did our third grade teacher tell us? The most beautiful thing sound to us is our own voice, hearing the sound of our name. But if I look out and see that Christopher on Twitter said something, everybody else realizes that we have a real-time connection, even if I didn't call out Daniel's name right at that time, right? You realize that we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of us here today. Now let me pause. If you are not a Twitter user, you can actually observe what's going on there if you go to search.twitter.com and type in #7 webinar since. So even if you're not a Twitter user, you can observe what's going on there. For those the rest of you, you'll notice in the upper right hand corner I put the hashtag on each of these take action slides. Call on people by name, enable interaction that's appropriate to your event. Notice that we don't have the chat open today for public consumption, the GoToWebinar chat, because we have a large public event and we want to honor your privacy, right? And like what James and I have done, we've got a chance still to create that sense of presence by being the voice of the audience, going, hey, Kelly said this, Christopher said that, Melanie said reach a larger audience, right? Now Melanie just became part of the presentation or part of the conversation, even though we're managing it with 800 of us here today. Let me share a story with you. In a book written by Jason Jennings and Lawrence Houghton, called It's Not the Big That Eat the Small, It's the Fast That Eat the Slow, they talk about visiting the management team of the Toyota manufacturing plant, I think it was in Jackson, Tennessee. And they're talking about efficiency and everybody pulling together as a vision. And the management team said, why don't you go out to the floor and ask anybody how they create value here. So they walk up to a guy holding a broom and said, well, so how is what you do creating value for the company? And he says, well, look over there. We've got robots that are part of the manufacturing process, and there are computers that are part of operating those robots. Well, dust is the enemy of computers, and my broom is the enemy of the dust. One of the core challenges, and I'm going to call it sin number 3, is that in this world we're not thinking about how we design our PowerPoint or other parts of the experience for those shorter attention spans. Whether it's the cart leading the horse or the horse leading the cart, one of the things that has evolved in the last couple generations are attention spans that are much more significantly influenced by screen-based media. You know, by the way, we're kind of screen-based here, aren't we? What we know from cognitive science, and that Hollywood has put together, put to use quite well in things like 24 or Bruce Willis action flicks is that change gets attention. And if we were to apply that to the world of our organization's PowerPoint, it might mean that we divorce the idea of a slide having some duration of time. Does that make sense? And I want to challenge you to think about slides maybe in different categories. Instead of every slide being what I would just call a content slide, the spreadsheet, the table, the graph, the chart. Again, I'm not saying we get away from that stuff. That's part of what we do, right? But if the goods, the content is what we often use, maybe we think about sometimes when we tell a story like the one that I just shared, where we think about ourselves a little bit more like Hollywood and go, ooh, is there a way we could take advantage of the fact that we've got this live audio-visual medium and help the meaning making, which is the context that comes out of story, right? That's why we so appreciate and learn more effectively from story. I also think that it's useful for us to remind people visually when and where they're supposed to do something, right? You want an interactive audience, or they missed the opening sequence of the webinar and missed the instructions or the hashtag or whatever that was. So let me take one other step on this content thing. So we just saw a story study out of the University of Virginia Tech, Tennessee. They studied how the design of headlines affects audience retention. Now, assuming you are in the knowledge and change business of some sort, this is useful. The study found that complete ideas in a slide title improved content retention, and if you look down here at the bottom, massive difference in recall of content when we went from, say, category type of slide title to this. Now, they actually went one step further and a few years later did an additional analysis and said there is empirical evidence that isn't in the world of PowerPoint that also should inform how we design PowerPoint. And I think this is especially pertinent in a short attention span environment, which was that, one, there is an orientation of the subject, which was that research on the headline, but that we need a clear mental picture of what's going on, which was research done in the 80s about picture superiority effect, and then logical connections, which comes from the science of rhetoric. And they proposed what they call alternative slide design. Now, we've all seen Gar Reynolds and Nancy Duarte and pretty stuff that many of our bosses won't let us do, but even this isn't necessarily the prettiest slide on the planet, but it is a more effective representation of how we might communicate something. So as an example, might we take something like this and simply go, if what I need is to make a point in a clear, salient way, and my point was, the East team is bringing in better revenue recognition. I don't think it has to be in the slide title, but the question is, where do the eyeballs go? And is it no-brainer, drop dead, easy for someone to understand if they just kind of glanced over because they were otherwise working on a second computer and working on email? Same kind of thing when it comes to like all those bullet points that we put on slides and going, where and how might we move that into something a little more visual, both in terms of going from a topic type of headline to maybe a benefit-oriented headline, and a visual representation of that which it is that we're doing. So, final thought here, and I'm going to drop out of full screen PowerPoint mode and go to what they call slide sorter view. Last idea I want you to take away from the world of Hollywood, which is the idea of storyboarding. All right. For me, I use the big blue slides as kind of the placeholders, but you see the story right there in the middle, right? Why is that important? Before we get into all of the detail about whatever it is that we're speaking or teaching on, one critical thing that emerges is that the brain needs to understand the big picture of an idea before you get into all the detail. It's a simple cognitive function. One of the beautiful things about Hollywood is they take a step back and go, visually, how is this going to unfold in a storyboard before they start going and shooting stuff, or in our case, before we go create PowerPoint slides. I think it's useful to think about one idea per slide, maybe different types of slides, and storyboard the big picture first. So I'm going to take a sip of water, and James, let's make sure we've knocked down those questions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, I'm going to jump over to Brandon, and he's speaking for a lot of folks here in terms of that attention span, right, shorter attention spans. He's wondering if you have a rule here in terms of how long is too long for a webinar. A lot we see they're scheduled for an hour. Some people I'm seeing are starting to go 45 minutes, even 30 minutes more frequently in terms of events scheduled, but shorter duration per each. What are some of your thoughts? What are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Great question, and I think it depends on what the need is, right? So I've seen very effective online virtual classrooms that might go into the big umbrella of webinar, webcast on virtual classroom that are 3 hours long, but it's a lot of small group work and a lot of interactivity and a lot of hands-on work and that kind of thing. And you're absolutely right. The other end of the spectrum, I've seen effective. In fact, I'm doing one on Thursday that's going to be 20 minutes plus 40 minutes of Q&A. We're going to do a 20-minute webinar, just a quick in and out on a topic, and then it's kind of like come one, come all, ask the expert Q&A. I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think it kind of depends on what your purpose is, and I don't think going shorter or longer is right or wrong, especially shorter if it's in the marketing context.
Let's do one more question here, and then folks, we're going to do some other interactive things, including we're going to call on one of you and try and get you on the phone with us to work through a little session with Roger and do a demonstration with Roger. So we're going to want you on the phone lines. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. But if you're feeling adventurous and want to join part of the presentation here today, we'll share how you can. Recorded versus live. Todd wondering, is there an appropriate time when you might want to ditch doing something live, like we're doing today, we are live, to just pre-recording something and putting it out there for people to consume on demand?
Sure. And you know what, Todd? Can we have a little fun, right? See the silly grin on my face? It's always kind of the face made for radio here. If we were not live, you could not have asked me that question, right? On the flip side of the coin, how many times have any of us attended a webinar where it might as well have been a recording because for all of the opportunity you had to interact, get your question answered, and I totally think there's time when you just want to pre-record something and put it out there. Totally fine. I don't think it's a right or a wrong. Are you going to take advantage of that live interactivity and the fact that they can actually come and talk to the president of the company or the product manager or whatever that happens to be? Sometimes there's a lot of power in that Q&A. One of the questions that went by was from Joe, who said, if I met Joe, who said, Joe, where was Joe's question?
Was it about the Q&A, Roger?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I found it here. What about interspersing Q&A throughout the webinar as opposed to the end, if you can gauge how long the answer might take?
I think that's absolutely useful if and when and unless you radically lose momentum, and what you really don't want to do is spend, here we're, a scant third of the way in, we stop for some Q&A because the Q&A panel is so full, and we kind of expected it with this large audience. But the last thing you would want, unless you knew about it in advance, was for us to spend 20 minutes doing Q&A. With that, I think we're actually going to keep on rolling. So you will notice over on the right-hand side, and I'm going to even just show you on the screen, you see that little hand up right there? You have a chance to put your hand up, and I'm looking for a volunteer who either is on telephone or is on voice over IP with a headset, because we're going to look for a volunteer to do something that talks about or works on what's the foundational or fundamental part of where this all starts. We've got to sound good in a webinar. Now, here's the instructions for all of you in the audience. Okay? This upcoming exercise is going to be one where we use the questions panel, and I'm going to actually ask for you to kind of, in the American Idol sense of things, be the judge and jury on a before and after exercise. Okay? So that's where you'll either share an observation or put in your recommendation. The question is one of finding your resonance. James, do we have a volunteer?
We do, and I'm going to change up there. There's your male voice, my male voice. I'm going over to Laura's female voice, Laura Martell with us. Laura, I've just unmuted your phone line. Hey, how are you today?
Hello, doing well. How are you?
I'm well. Roger's got a big smile on his face like he always said he had. So, Roger, Laura's with us. Do with her what you need to.
All right. Thank you for being here, Laura. I'm going to cover a couple ideas, and then we're just going to tackle an exercise. And thank you for volunteering and hanging in here with us. So here's the idea. One of the challenges in the world of the virtual presentation is that it changes the relative importance of the stimuli that we in the audience receive, right? In fact, one study that I did had 620 people rank 17 different success factors, and they came back and said, hey, webinar solution needs to be easy to use. Quality of the speaker's voice or delivery needs to be useful or effective. So here's what I want you to do. Laura, would you read this out loud in your normal voice for everybody in the audience?
Sure. Research tells us that attempting to persuade by words alone is about as effective as trying to chop down a tree with a Swiss Army knife.
All right. Virtual round of applause for Laura. Here's the exercise. And I'm going to ask each of you in the audience to do this as well. It's called speaking from your lower middle voice. So thank you, Claudia. Claudia gives you a bunch of applause. There you go. All right. So I want you to stand up wherever you're at. You heard me correctly. I want you to stand up wherever you are at. I want you to take a couple fingers and put them on your throat. Dudes, that's our Adam's apple, or our larynx, right? And I want you to purse your lips. And Laura, I'm going to have you do this in just a moment, but everybody in the audience, this is the exercise. We'll purse our lips and say from the top of our range to the bottom of our range. All right, all the way back up. Obviously, we can't hear 800 of you, but we can hear Laura. Laura, take a stab at that. All right. I could hear you chuckling back there. See, nobody ever made you do this in a webinar before, did they, Laura?
No, never.
Okay, here, we're going to do it one more time, and I want to teach each and every one of you what you're looking for. Roger Love, one of those voices from all the movies, one of those voiceover guys, one of those kind of voices. In his book called Love Your Voices, you want to speak from your lower middle voice. For you actors and musicians, that's our diaphragmatic voice. But our goal is not to speak in the lowest voice possible, but it's to take advantage of one truth, which is every one of us can find an optimum resonance for how you are built, which is to speak from your lower middle voice. So we're going to go, not all the way down there, we want to kind of go right there. And what we want to do is say, where and how does my body most naturally resonate? With me? All right, so Laura, we're going to go back to that same little thing, and I want you to kind of find that spot where you feel like, ooh, I was speaking up in my chest voice, now I'm going to speak down in my lower middle voice. And I want you to say this again, and our gracious audience has offered to give us some feedback.
All right.
Go for it.
Research tells us that attempting to persuade by words alone is about as effective as trying to chop down a tree with a Swiss Army knife.
All right, more virtual applause. Thank you, Laura, for being an awesome, good sport. And Jeremy says, is my Adam's apple supposed to move? You may actually feel it descend down just a little bit. Mary gives you a big excellent. All right, so did you hear a difference? Did you not hear a difference? April says, I don't hear a difference, but I don't understand how to find the right tone either. Okay, sit tight. We'll come back to that. Ooh, Genevieve says, very good. Maybe it's still a little bit too high. A couple no differences. Eric says needs a pause, which is maybe a separate difference. So a number of you in a couple different counts. Kofi, I hope I got that right, said second time was better. First time was good too. I would agree. Here's my observation. What I heard was a lot more clarity, even if maybe we didn't get to the resonance, and it sounded like Laura was on a speakerphone, which would certainly affect kind of the aural quality of what we're hearing. But let me repeat or wrap up the final thought. If you want to sound like a rock star, you've got to open up your core. That's that's from the bottom of your armpits down to your lower gut. If you ever want to test this, do that exercise of finding your resonance while you're standing up, and then see what happens when you sit down, which of course is our common position when we speak at a webinar. And then we speak from that lower middle voice, and you'll just have to get used to it. But here's the thing. When our adrenaline goes up, it tends to be that our voice moves into our chest, and research has shown that a thinner voice sounds less trustworthy, less authoritative. You're not going to have to sound like a movie star to improve your own optimum resonance the way that you are made. Any one of us can do it. All right, number 5, thank you all. And James, keep the cards and letters coming, and then we'll open it up for Q&A as we're barreling towards the end here. Not learning the 3 types of virtual body language. On this slide, you'll notice in kind of the upper center portion of the screen, you see obviously a guy pointing to a slide, a point on the slide, which kind of doesn't make any a lot of sense. But it's a little different than what you see down in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, right? The same content available online, and I know this is instinct, right, would be minus that little piece of body language. And as you can imagine, one of the most frequently asked questions that anybody ever asks is, I lose that sense of connection, right? We may not even thought through why we've lost that sense of connection. Here's what I want you to remember. Number 1, in this world, and if you've ever used web conferencing, you've figured out that you can get a pen or a drawing tool or something where you can underline or point or have a highlighter or type or those kinds of things, right? And you can direct attention visually. Now you can tell that I use sparse quantities of slides so that there is no guessing what the point of the slide is, right? But much of the time we're not there. But there's also one other thing, there's several other things you can do. I also want you to direct attention verbally. If you were to go back and listen to the recording of what I just did, you'd find that I used a technique from the world of neuro-linguistic programming, which is to say, if you look in the upper center of the slide, like a question, or give a direction like, what do you see on the, or an imperative like, look at what's on the table in front of the girls. Or maybe you leave off something like, so in the lower right-hand corner of the slide you will see, every one of those is something that breaks state. It directs attention, and you can do that with your voice, even if you don't know where the little pen thing is. Direct attention visually, with like a drawing tool or something like that. Direct it verbally, and now let's talk about what happens when we are on camera. As many of you know, GoToMeeting has high definition video conferencing, HD faces, and it's coming in GoToWebinar very soon. And here's an interesting thing that I did on behalf of Citrix. Last summer, Citrix and I worked together on a 1,200-person video conferencing study, and we said, hey, when you're sitting in the audience, when you're an attendee of a video conference, how would you rate leaders of video conferences? And the sentence was, I find it distracting or annoying when, number 1 and number 2, distracting mannerisms or gestures and or cluttered or distracting background. Now, the second thing is, you know, what's on the bookshelf behind you, or is there something on the whiteboard that I'm trying to look at instead of you, right? Now, bear in mind this was a 7-point Likert scale, which means that this is the midpoint. That means we don't want to. I'm not saying it's okay to act as if you're unaware. What I want to say is this, since we're talking about body language. What happens when we are near to a camera? Our facial expressions get more exaggerated. Our hands may move out of the field of vision of the camera, compared to, say, if we were on a stage where our actions should be as large as the room, right? We're reaching the person in the back of the room. We don't have that problem when we move our body language into a virtual environment. So we can direct attention visually, we can direct it verbally, and we can figure out, or I should say adapt. It's not hard, it's just different, right? But more importantly, these are subtle, if not important, ways to keep your audience not only focused or keep from being, you know, disgusted with how your face is too close to the camera and looks weird because you're not used to presenting on camera. Does that make sense? Number 6, not learning to make virtual eye contact, right? So if one of the most frequently asked questions is how do I, you know, I deal with this sense of discomfort, one of the most frequently asked questions is, how do I engage an audience that I can't see? last year I had my assistant go back over the questions submitted in webinars where I spoke to more than 20,000 people. So as scientific an analysis as that could be, number one pain point is, I don't see you, you don't see me, and how do I know you're not off doing something else? Well, I don't perfectly know, but there are things that we can do, which is exactly what we've been talking about. What pilots do when they can't see is they fly by their instruments. And it's quite fortunate when it's snowing or foggy or dark. What we can do, I'm not saying it's better or right or wrong, it is different. We have an instrument panel that gives us insight, whether it's the chat, like like Michael, who says, thanks for a great webinar, I have to leave early. Thanks, sorry to see you go, Michael, right? That only happens if your tools are open so that you can see them. What is the default? The default is I got to click it a couple times to get to chat or Q&A or Twitter or something like that, right? GoToWebinar, of course, has these other tools like, this attention meter. So if it's important for you to see if people are nodding off after lunch or something like that, you can do that. Here, I typically present with either one computer. Let me go back. When I present with one computer, this is literally what I do. I open up questions in chat, questions for public, and then chat often so that, say, James can say, hey, Roger, your fly is down, right? And if I am presenting with two computers or an extra screen, I actually open up chat. Here's an extra little tip. Notice this. I actually adjust this size right here. You with me? So all I see is the question and the asker. In my role right now, I don't need to see when the question was received or if Caroline just shot you back an answer or if James just shot you back an answer. I just open it up so I can see as much as I can. Then I open up Twitter and I keep it open like that so I can see that 2D4 Marketing and Kathy and Isaac and Mary and Tom all were sharing on Twitter. And if they asked me a question there, I could respond to that as well. Obviously, some of the other tools that you may have available to you might give you alternative ways to call on people by name, depending on how you're doing this. This is more common in smaller presentations or meetings where I see that Beth said something and I can respond to Beth by name, but that's pretty powerful relative to the telephone where my alternative is to go, oh, was that Julie or Jane that said that, right? So if you've got an at-a-glance tool, it could be a poll, it could be chat, it could be Q&A, whatever your tool is that you like to be able to glance at, like a dashboard, right? You don't stare at the speedometer of your car. You learn to glance there and get meaningful feedback without going off the road. Now that said, I think it's okay to pause once in a while. You can tell the audience, hey, I'm going to pause for a second, grab a sip of water and knock down a question or two. I think totally all right. And if you've got a rock star like James, James can participate in being the voice of the audience, right? Jumping in or whatever that might be. Final thought. Big challenge, this one. We kind of went from big picture down to tactical stuff. Final one is kind of the big picture thing. Mistake number 7 is thinking webinar is a one-size-fits-all thing. This study that I referenced a little bit earlier, and if you stick around for Q&A, I'm going to chat out to you links where you can go get all these from Citrix. I actually did something that has never been done before in research, which was actually to parse out that why people leave by type of webinar, right? Guy Kawasaki's on the stage, that's the thought leadership type of webinar. How-to or training content, product or sales, that doesn't mean you can't sell in a webinar. Totally all right if you're honest with people. There was one additional thing that we did, which was to do a statistical analysis of these 13 panes and with where that was more or less important. So statistical significance. Thought leadership webinar, don't read the slides. Now, they don't like it in any context, but more likely to leave the webinar early. Oh, Guy Kawasaki's reading slides. I know he doesn't, but you know what I mean? Oh, check this out. Introduction or housekeeping is too lengthy.
blah, 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 blah. Here's about me, here's about my company. Oh, and in the upper right-hand corner is where you're going to find the check mark. And on the third Thursday of the month, we have a Rotary Club meeting. And you know what I mean? You've all been to those webinars, haven't you? Right? Notice there's probably the highest tolerance for no interaction in a thought leadership webinar. And you know what? If it's training or sales or I want to talk to you, I want to talk to you, by golly, right? So again, I will get you out a link. Here's one of the places that this tends to manifest itself, and we're all done. It tends to be in having the wrong tools for the job. Very frequently, I see people running webinars on a meeting-oriented platform, or they're trying to do some complex, interactive, virtual classroom type of session on a meeting platform. And that's okay as a start, but oftentimes the right tool for the right job is the difference between getting it done and saving a plane ticket and kicking it out of the park. You with me? So number 7 is thinking that webinar as a word is a format. Remember the conversation a little earlier. Could it be 30 minutes, or could it be 3 hours? Yes. Could it be for sales, marketing, or whatever? Yes. Is there a perfect way to do an intro welcome script? No. Right thing for the right job. Final thought for you here. In my very office building, where my 1080 Group World headquarters is, there is a sign on the wall that says you can't make footprints in the sands of time if you're sitting on your butt. And who wants to make butt prints in the sands of time? Here's what I know. If you invest yourself in some kick butt webinars, or you're the marketer and you're helping your presenters get more invested in adapting to the medium, figure out how we go, hey, Alexandra and Jessica and Deanna, thank you for being here. You rock. Designed for shorter attention spans. It's not the same as being in person. It's not insurmountable, but it's not the same as being in person. Anybody can improve their vocal resonance, figure out how we communicate what we send and how we see. How do we show and how do we see? And then remember that then you might even take it to the next level. If you go, might a different type, go to training or go to webinar be better than go to meeting for me? Or do we do the 30-minute for the marketing webinar and 90 minutes for our training session? Is a totally okay thing to ask. Here's what I know. When you get to the end of the day, all those people in your audience that have sat through all of those webinars about webinars and went, yeah, blah, 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 I'm going to work on some email while I kind of listen on a speakerphone, are going to come back to you and go, you rocked it. James, another sip of water. Let's have some fun. I see some old piles of questions, and away we go.
Piles of questions. I'm going to start with a comment from Christine, and she says, hey, many proof that, Roger, your techniques work. She registered for 2 webinars. Both were taking place today at the same time. So she popped them both open. She says she's had the other webinar on mute most of the time, been drawn to watching yours. She also observed that they committed some of the sins, hardly ever changing slides, or they didn't have anything visually interesting happening on their screen, so she was more inclined to watch what you were doing and presenting than this other one. So, Christine, thanks for multitasking, doing 2 webinars at once. That worked out nice.
You know, I was actually doing James's job once moderating, and I had somebody chat in, is the webinar broken? Because they had spent so long just talking about one slide. They literally thought the webinar had broken. I'm like, no, sorry, it hasn't. So, hey, FYI, remember that if when you got a roll, you know, you'll get a copy of the slide, or you'll get a link to the survey. Sign up. You can win a book. James will tell you all about that. I'm going to pause also, James, while you get the next question, and chat out all of those links. If you're still with me, all of these links to these papers and stuff, I'm going to start dropping into the chat to all function.
Perfect. And again, all you have to do, fill out the survey at the end. 7 copies of Roger's book. We're going to pull names at random. Digital copies will be coming your way. The hard print won't be out. Just went to the printers in the last day or so. So hard copy won't be available for about a month, but the virtual copy will be available. Also, we're going to do an after-hours session, which is going to lead into a question we had here from Alexandra. That after-hours session, Laura Lieber from Citrix Online, she's going to join us at the top of the hour. It's about 15 minutes from now. And then we're going to take 8 to 10 minutes to talk about new opportunities with GoToWebinar. So hang on board if you can for that. If you can't, we will continue to record. You can come back to the on-demand version of that. That being said, so that was going to segue a little bit into Alexandra, who asked this question. If you end up going overtime, right, you schedule, you plan, I don't care what it is, 30 minutes, 45, an hour like we have today. If you're going to go overtime, is it best, Roger, to acknowledge that, or do you just keep on plugging through, pretend that you didn't notice you're over, and you just don't mention it?
That is pretty close to sin number 1.2. So if you're going to go over, I would get clean. I would come clean with the audience right away. One, because if you put it on their calendar for an hour, especially since they're sitting at their desk, they may just be right off to the next meeting. And two, no audience will ever complain if you end early. They will. You're the south end of a northbound horse when you go long.
What about Helen here asking this? And we have a mixed group, Roger. Some folks are focusing on B2B type of webinars, right? A business-to-business type webinar.
Yep.
Different type of marketing efforts go into a B2C type of, when we're talking to consumers. Do all these tips, though, affect and work in both B2B and B2C?
I think so. I think probably there's a couple key differences that may actually bubble up in a couple different ways. With B2C, you might find a different slot besides 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, right? I know B2C companies that do stuff in the evenings or on the weekends because that's when people are home from work. That may or may not be right for you. I know a car parts manufacturer that does webinars for auto mechanics in the evening. Why? Because they're under the hood of your car during the day. The other place that you might find, you may actually want to make it something that is more of a sales presentation like an infomercial, right? I mean, if you're up front with people, you can do that and have a call to action, and here's a link to get a special on the whatever it is that you're selling, because your business model is a little different. The world of infomercials is still around 30, 40 years after invention, in part because they work and some people will sit there and watch.
Heather is doing a webinar on Friday. Already thinking of many changes I'm going to implement! Heather, we're glad this hit the target. Good luck on your event. Join us on another event that Roger does, Heather, and tell us how it went. We'd love to hear about that. Brandon asking you, Roger, how many presenters are too many? Can multiple presenters be better? Should you strive to have more people on instead of just one voice?
You know, I always think that it's useful to have more than one active voice, which is probably an argument against the typical moderator who just is the glorified phone operator who just, says hello and then you never hear from them again. However, they need to add value, right? So James is killer at adding value by it being the voice of the audience in a variety of things. Here's the key. I've seen multi-person panels. I've sat on multi-person panels with up to 5 people doing that, and it works just fine. You just have to figure out how, relative to your tool, your content, what you're doing, how you're going to keep things coordinated, and usually that happens in a rehearsal. Here's how the moderator or MC is going to ask the questions, or whatever that is. Maybe it's a linear. Roger does part 1, James does part 2, and we avoid stepping on each other. In this particular case, James knows that he can't bother me, so he's welcome to jump in at any times.
Voice. Let's get back to some questions about that. We'll start Jay, his thought here. Do guys tend to speak too low? And should guys think about increasing their range somewhat, maybe looking for a higher tone now and again? Did too many guys try and come on like me, an old 1950s radio guy now, and really go for that deep tone when it probably is more distracting than anything?
Yeah, I think the number one thing you want to do is be authentic. Now, that said, authentic comes from your heart and, breathing a little bit. But that said, you're going to sound the richest relative to the way that your body is made when you resonate the most, right? It's like the same way a guitar body resonates or the body of a piano resonates as part of the sound-making process. And research has shown that can make you sound more, like I said, more authoritative or credible. That said, pace, pitch, pause, maybe you do something for effect, by changing your tonality is a powerful part of the rest of the speaking experience.
I don't know necessarily that I would lay out a blanket statement and say, guys, don't speak in your lower voice. I think my recommendation would be, unless you've really worked with a coach and have figured something else out, speaking in your lower middle voice is going to be optimum for most people who are not professional presenters.
Tiffany wants to know, how many times should we be checking in with the audience, making them either do things like respond to a poll or touch their machines and type in like we had folks here today, or even get on the telephone line and check in with some folks? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Two things. Very recent, meaning published in a journal but not available to the public yet. Very recent research out of the University of North Texas corroborates that you probably don't want to have any given segment of your presentation go longer than 20 minutes. It's kind of a feather in the cap for people like Ted, and I would temper that with this. In John Medina's book, Brain Rules, he actually observes that people's attention starts to wane after about 10 minutes, and that interval starts to shorten over time. I am loath to say you should push a poll every 3.8 minutes. What I do think is, one, start with where you would naturally interact with people. Maybe you're a keynote speaker and you never do. Maybe that's your gig. Where would you naturally ask for a show of hands, or whatever it is that you do to interact with the audience or keep your eye on them? And then how do we move that online? And then I would bump it up to a little shorter increments. Push it on the side of doing it a little more quickly. But if one time it's 3 minutes apart and one time it's 13 minutes apart, I don't think you've just committed a mortal sin. Staying and keeping it apart. Time today.
Mistake one was not investing in success. Slide 13, we saw, where do you spend more time for presentations? It was those in-person presentations. Brings us to Mary, asking any suggestions in terms of rehearsing and preparation for an online presentation. Roger, I know you put a ton of time in these. Drop some time that you spend on preparing your slides, doing your rehearsals, reviewing content. Tell them what you do.
You probably don't want to know what I do.
Yeah, they do.
I speak and teach for a living, and my goal is, in something like this, is to set a standard, not that says I am better or above anything, but I put in a lot of time so that we can get beyond a vision of what happens in the typical corporate environment, a typical government environment too, the public sector. It takes time to practice and rehearse. This is the no kidding, probably the 8th time I've made this presentation in the last 4 years, and I rehearsed it fully all the way through twice before today. True story. I typically am into a presentation 15 to 20 hours before I do it, if I have pre-existing content. If I'm starting from scratch, I'm into it 90 hours.
Yeah, I did an event last week, Roger, and I ran through it twice. Mary, this might help you out. I ran through it twice. I was right on target at 45 minutes, and I blew right over the time. I had to skip some pieces because I still didn't anticipate. I had too much content. I had to self-edit and cut things down. That's one to grow on for me next time. One rule that I often share with people, Roger, I don't know if this works for you, if you've come across it as well, but if people tell me, hey, I've rehearsed and my presentation's about 35, 40 minutes, in my head, as a moderator, I just check off, okay, we're going 45 or so. I always add 5 or 10 minutes because it just seems to go that way. Is that something you've seen too?
Yes, and for a couple of you, I stood up and walked around, and maybe my VoIP cord had a weird thing. Am I sounding better, JJ, John? Yes. You know what? You remember the old aphorism from Mark Twain where he said, I would have written you a shorter letter if I had had the time?
Yeah.
Whatever that paraphrase of Mark Twain was, right? It's not like he didn't know anything about writing, right? A concise 100-word summary is harder to write than just blurting out a 5-page blah, right? Well, until you've gone through your content in a manner that helps you know where you're at, and as a speaker, sometimes you'll figure out, where can I loosen it up and take a little extra time for questions? Where might I need to make up some time? Some of that only comes through practice when you know kind of where you're at on the road to the end of the path, the end of where you're going. And that only happens when you know your content and you've done it enough times so you know where you're at on the path.
Roger, there's some webcasts that people do, and they want to kind of test the comprehension of their audience. Do you have some easy ways for Michael? He finds himself in this position. So what are some ways that he can kind of test the comprehension, make sure that what he is saying is sticking with those folks that he's talking to?
Michael, let me ask you this. What is the context in which you are trying to make sure that they're getting it? Is it a training scenario? Are you just making, like you're doing a marketing webinar and you just want to make sure they understand your key points? Or what's the context? While, James, you're waiting for Michael's response, Cara says, Maya Angelou says, birds sing to tell stories, not facts. Amen. Yes, 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 yes. As salespeople put it sometimes, stories sell, facts tell, stories sell.
As we wait for Michael, if he still has an opportunity, it still looks like he's online. I can see if people have left or if they're still here. It still looks like Michael is on board here. Let's get back up, scroll right back up here. What about the idea, again, Alex here asking about trying to focus as a presenter on so many different inputs, the chat, the questions, the polls. I think you mentioned one thing, and it's worth repeating here, that pausing and actually telling the audience, I think that's what you said, Roger. You might say, you know what, folks, let me take a drink of water, let me look through some questions and address some of these. That's something that you can do as a solo presenter if you don't have a moderator or a team on board that's helping look through those. What are some other things that folks can do to keep focused on the content as well as the audience and all the other inputs coming in?
You know how in the world of storytelling there is such a thing as the story shape, right? There's an intro and then it might back off a little bit and then ultimately it climaxes to the end, right? There's kind of that story arc. Is what presenters or people who use their voices, storytellers, etc., also do that with how they pace and pitch and use pitch and pause and that kind of thing. All of that is, to me, a good analogy for how does a webinar flow, right? Remember the story slides where I went through a slide about every second and a half and we went through 6 or 7 slides as part of a short little story? And then you might sit on one slide where you pause and say, hey, I'm going to open it up to some questions. If you had no slides and you were just standing in front of a room of people, that's probably what would just kind of happen naturally. You're not thinking about it artificially because now we're trying to come put some slides or visuals or thinking, how am I going to use the tools to facilitate that? So the place I would always start is in analog, meaning what do you do in person? Is there a time when you cook through some content and then you pause to make sure reflection or discussion or those kinds of things to help that content set in? Start there, map it to your new room, and then you'll figure out, of course, those new tools that you can do. Ken puts in, how many firm takeaways can we reasonably expect from attendees? We'll make this the last one, James, because I know you got to roll onto the next thing. And Ken, if I called you Michael before and I was misunderstanding what James had said, then I would entirely apologize. You know, there are people who say, purists say, you got to have one point. We're going to put all of the weight of the hammer behind the point of the nail, right? And then there's the 3-point sermon people, like you can only remember 3 things. I honestly think it varies. The seminal research done in the 1950s was you can remember 7 to 9 things, which is how we ended up, or 5 to 9 things, which is how we ended up with a 7-digit phone number. I would err on the side of fewer, and or say where and how might we provide alternative mechanisms, like the handout that you'll get when you get a link to the recording. You'll get my handout that summarizes all of these. That way you can actually balance, I think, what you are going to remember by sitting here for an hour and what you might want to go reference because, oh, what was that he said? And now you've got the mnemonic enhancer in the form of a handout. Good question.
Hey, the thank yous extend to the Association of Strategic Marketing, the ASM, for their support on this event. Also GoToWebinar, Of course, my thanks to Roger for spending time on the 7 deadly sins of online presentations. You can keep in touch with Roger. Roger at thevirtualpresenter.com. That's the email. Thevirtualpresenter.com is the website address. Again, fill out the survey when you exit, and that will get 7 of you picked at random to get a copy of Roger's new book. That, again, is just going to the presses. We're going to get you a digital copy of that. The Virtual Presenter's 102 tips for online meetings. So good luck to 7 of you for getting that. On Twitter, the hashtag 7WebinarSins. You can follow Roger and team at 1080 Group, at 1080 Group, at 1080 Group on Twitter to stay in touch there. We have recorded, we are going to send out a reminder email. It's going to bring you back to the on-demand version. In the waning moments as well, in the chat tab, Roger did put out several of those links. There's a link to the 1080 group, also to SlideShare for some docs, so I encourage you to look in the chat tab, click on those. We are going to dive into our after-hours session here in just a moment, but before we do that, the biggest thank you goes to all of you for being on board, Trish and Victoria and everybody else. Thanks for being on board, sharing with us, interacting with us, and being part of today's presentation. With that, we are going to wrap things up, and I do appreciate you all being here. My name is James Hilliard, and we do look forward to talking to you all down the road.